Hey there. Thanks for tuning in. You ready for another episode of my Bigfoot sighting? Alright then, let's do this.
Seen a bunch of rundown no-horse towns where the church is the backbone, love's in the plow, and the five-string melodies grooving, with the farmland rows where the roots run deep, beyond the noise of the busy streets, where the songs of the South are soothing. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Yeah.
If you'd like to be able to listen to the show without ads and have full access to bonus content, that's an option. To find out how, please go to mybigfootsighting.com.
My Bigfoot Sightings is a compilation of many experiences I've had growing up on the farm. There were many strange experiences that had happened. My grandfather, who owned the farm, my parents had some property on the farm as well. My other grandparent from my dad's side, who was from Oklahoma, he and his wife lived there on the property as well, and he was an avid hunter. We grew up as feral children, basically. We were free-range kids. My grandfather had a 110-acre farm. There was a river, a small stream, they called it the Muddy Fork, which ran all the way down into the Mohican River, which would then go all the way down into the Coshocton and down in through there. And as kids, we would go and wander the fields. We would walk behind the tractors as they were out planting and things like that. We would find arrowheads all the time. I mean, it was just so many. We would find them all the time. So that was my first kind of interest was, these cool rocks, and it wasn't until I got older that I took some college-level archaeology classes and learned to date them and understand the time periods that they came from. That was kind of my main interest at that point in time. But as kids, we were just always out in the woods, out in the streams. We were running here, running there. And it wasn't until probably the mid-'70s, the state started to bring back turkeys, wild turkeys and things like that. And then, of course, with the wild turkeys, once they got established, then, we started getting more coyotes. We started getting more, actually, wildlife. So it was just commonplace that, you might see like a turkey, or you'd see a coyote, or you'd hear one barking off in the distance once we got into the 80s. In the 70s, I used to do a lot of raccoon hunting with my grandfather, because back then they used to have many, you could actually get paid for the pelts and things. And we used to go raccoon hunting. My grandfather had a lot of coon hunting dogs, and he was known for having very good animals. Several times I would be out hunting with him, and that was probably my junior high days. And of course, I didn't have the gun. He carried the gun. We would take the dog out, go out looking in the woods and areas. And one time the dog came back, and the dog loved to hunt, and that was what it lived for. And when the dog came back, it just curled up with his tail between his legs at the foot of my grandfather. And he just said, he must have seen a booger. And I'm like, a booger? Like a boogeyman? Ha ha. Okay, Grandpa, whatever. And I just dismissed that and just thought, well, that was kind of odd that the dog came back. And he said, well, the dog's not going to hunt here. We're going to go somewhere else and hunt in another spot. So we left, and that's what we did. And that just kind of stuck in my mind. I never, ever thought anything of it until I watched, of course, the Finding Bigfoot show. And when they were talking about people from the South calling them boogers. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. to me at the time, it just was kind of like, okay, whatever. So then we move on. And again, my grandfather, he loved to hunt, loved to fish. He would go fish the Ohio River, catch huge catfish, and they would bring them back. And he had a big washing machine tub insert. He would put the catfish in, or if he had a big snapping turtle, he'd put that in, and then he had a lid on there, and the lid would latch and have it down in the stream that ran past our house. And he would leave it in there for a few weeks to kind of clean it out before they butchered it and filleted it and put it in the freezer. And there was an instance, and he had a big catfish in there, and they went down, and the lid was open, and the catfish was gone. And of course, my dad says, "Oh, did you kids let that fish out?" And we're like, "No, we didn't know anything about that, you know." And again, that was just a incident that was weird. Probably the year following that, my dad, he was a smoker, and of course, my mom would say, "Go out on the back porch and smoke." And this was in probably December, because it was like one of the first few light snows. He went out to have a cigarette, and I was in junior high about that age, and he came in and just was white as a ghost. And I've never seen my dad look like that. I heard him shouting out the back door, and he came in and he just said, "You kids go up to bed now." And we had a 3-story house, and he said, "I saw somebody outside." And I'm like, "I want to see." So he goes, "No, stay away from the window. You need to go upstairs now." And sent all of us kids upstairs. So I ran upstairs, of course, ran to the back of the house where there was a window in the bathroom. And I am like looking out the window to see if I see anything. Of course, I didn't see anything. And of course, back then, parents were more like, kids are kids, and they don't always listen to what we're saying. And I remember him telling my uncle, a buddy of his, how this big person came on the other side of the car, and he like said, "You get out of here. I'm going in and getting my gun," which he didn't have a gun as far as I knew. But that's when he came inside, and he said he went out the next day, and there were footprints that went down our driveway and then over the fence, across the ditch, and then into the woods, where later on I had my sighting. So this is when I was like a kid. Years went by. We didn't have any more noticeable activity at that point. I went off to college. I came back from college. Then me and my family, we moved into the big house, we called it, or my parents' house. And then they built like a new house on the adjacent property next door. And again, when I came back and I had taken some archaeology classes, I had got interested in learning about these artifacts that I were finding. And many of them were like 8,000, 9,000 years ago. They're early archaic points. And many of them I were finding down close to where the Muddy Fork River was. And that Muddy Fork River actually, like, if you take it north, it will run up to the what's called the Black River, and then the Black River runs all the way up to Lake Erie. If you take it south, it runs into the Mohican River, which goes down to Coshocton, which is a flint quarry. There's Nellie, Coshocton flint, and a lot of the flint that I would find, flint flakes and fragments, were actually from that site. So this is like a natural kind of waterway. There is also a little town called West Salem, which actually had exposed salt. And then if you head east of West Salem towards Rittman, then that's where Morton Salt is, and there's like huge salt mines and things. So we have salt. We had, of course, a natural waterway for the natives that traveled frequently. So I don't know if that plays a factor into Sasquatch or Bigfoot, but they seem to follow the water systems, which is an easy way to get out of sight. most people don't develop there because of the flooding, the trees, and those types of things. But anyhow, I used to go out and I'd walk back and forth in the fields. I mean, usually I'd start about this time of year when you have a good freeze at night and then a warming during the day. The stones and things would often work their way right up to the top. So it was easy to find. And I used to go out and just walk back and forth, go out and walk about 100 yards, turn around, go over maybe 4 feet, back and forth, back and forth. And as I was walking in the one field down towards the riverway, I remember seeing, well, you're looking down, first of all, for minutes at a time. And then I have to look up and look away to refocus. And at the end of the far, far, far end of the field, which is probably several hundred yards away, there was a dead tree. And the tree trunk was silver. And I remember looking up and I looked at the tree and there was like another big silver trunk, silver thing right next to that tree. And so I look down, I look up to refocus my eyes, and it looked like a big silver like trunk with an arm attached to the other silver trunk. And I'm just like, I'm like, I can't believe, like, what is that? And I look down again to focus my eyes, and then it's not there. So I'm like, well, that was weird. So that's like just a weird experience that I'm like, don't understand. And many times we see, like, there's weirdness that happens and you just dismiss it because you're like, okay, well, that was weird. Go on with your life. So I didn't think much about that. I just dismissed it. It was just kind of like a eyesight focusing thing or something. And then it wasn't that time, but another time I was kind of like, well, I haven't gone down to check along that tree line down there. And so when I went down there, and again, this is early spring, so it's the freeze thaw cycle. So it's if it warms up or rains a lot, it can be kind of mucky and muddy. And this was more of the mucky, muddy down towards the river part of the field. And when I went down there, I noticed that there were large impressions in the mud. And they were down a good, like probably 18 inches, a foot, 18 inches, and big wide steps towards the woods. And of course, logically, I'm thinking, okay, this is obviously it's mucky, it's muddy. The farmer was down here, he had his big boots on, and he's trying to walk across the field and sinking in the mud. And so he's trying to take big steps. And that, again, that was just what my mind was telling me. I'm not saying that that's not what it was, but it was just kind of like heading towards the woods. And I was like, okay, I dismissed that. And again, when you live out in the country, there's weirdness that happens and you're just kind of like, okay, well, that's weird. You move on. There's no way you can scientifically test or prove anything. You just like, okay, whatever. That was strange. And then also, as the weather would warm up, of course, we would go out and search for morel mushrooms. And my dad, he knew a good spot where there was a sycamore tree. And there were times he would go out there and he would have to take his jacket off and fill his jacket full of, there were so many mushrooms that he would find. And of course, since knowing where that spot was, and that spot was opposite on the other side of the house that I grew up, it was a kind of a woodland pasture that usually they didn't let people hunt there unless you were familiar with the family. And we used to go out there. We'd cut firewood from fallen trees, things of that nature, go out and look for mushrooms and things. And we would go out there all the time. And that was like another place I played as a child. We would go out, knew that woods just from the back of my hand. and we would always go out there, look for mushrooms in the springtime. And at the point in time when I went to college, they had multiflora roses, and they would come through, mow them all down with like a tractor and a mower. But that would just basically cut them down. They'd come right back even stronger. So these multiflora rose bushes had just taken over. And it was like you could hardly walk through the areas that used to be clear. And I remember going out to look for mushrooms, and I had to take a machete and literally hack these canes down in order to make a path to get back to where the sycamore tree was that normally had so many of these mushrooms in the correct conditions. And I would be out there, and these were like, had a lot of virgin, I think they were beech trees, beech or birch. They were huge. I think they were beech trees, and they were huge. They had people who had carved their initials into them, like back in the 1800s, that you could still see in the bark. And I would go back there, and it was just the coolest woods ever, because the trees were so big. It was like nothing but moss that grew on the ground, or like a sphagnum moss or some type of a moss. The stream cutting through there. And I would like go all the way back there. And now that I hear, they talk about wood knocks and things, we'd be back there and you'd hear but it wasn't a woodpecker, because we know what woodpeckers sound like. It was more of a knocking sound, but you could never really see anything. Again, it was this weirdness that you just accept and like, oh, well, that's odd. So we'd go out, have our explorations, and then come back. Well, this was like after I had moved in. This would have been like probably like about 1980, 87, 88. And, I'd go out and hack my way out to look for mushrooms. And on the way back, it was like I'd hear that knock, knock, knock sound and always wonder, like, what is that? So I would come back towards the house, and it was like I had a feeling that like somebody was watching me. I didn't hear anything. I just had a feeling. And so I would walk, and I would turn around and look behind me, and I didn't see anything. And as I got closer to the house, I turned, just spun on my heels and turned around and looked. And I saw something go into the deep briars, and it was a buttocks and a thigh and a calf and a foot, and kind of a reddish, chestnut brown, reddish hair. And I was kind of like, well, what? Well, that is like weird. And so I stopped and looked and didn't hear anything, didn't see anything. I just kind of continued on back to my house. And then it wasn't until the following year. And again, this was like back like 1980, 88, 89. And back then we had very extremely warm winters. I mean, it was like not like now. It's kind of like 70s in February, and then March came, and we had like 70s, 80s, very warm year. So I was decided, well, it's been so warm, I'm going to go out early this year across the field from my house in order to see if any of those mushrooms have come up since it's so warm. And so I started out across the house, and this was probably no more than like 100 yards from we had a picture window facing the road. And as I crossed the road, and then there was an area that was always like a small depression that may have been like a farm holding pond, possibly, because back in the early 1800s or early to mid 1800s, there was houses on the other side of the street, which are no longer there. They're long gone. But there was a depression that would always collect water. So in the spring, you'd have the spring peepers always there, cheep, cheep, cheep. And there were a stand of hawthorn trees. And hawthorn trees get those huge spike needles on them where, like, if they poke your skin, it's like instant infection, and it just hurts for a week or so. I didn't have my machete at that point in time. I just had a big walking stick, and I'm out walking through the multiflora canes, kind of gingerly pushing them out of the way so I can kind of get through to where I want to go. And as I step into the clearing, and I'm, looking at the canes, and I step into this small clearing, and probably like about 15 foot in front of me is a tall, just muscle-jacked beast that had to have been 7-8 foot tall. And again, this is like about probably 11 o'clock in the morning. And I remember the sunlight hitting it, and the highlights of this, it had like strawberry blonde highlights in this kind of a chestnut brown hair. And it wasn't a fur, it was hair, because it was a thick hair, but you could see the skin through it. And it was more of a, I want to say like ashy, brownish kind of color. But anyhow, I just stepped into the clearing, and my mouth literally dropped open, and I'm just frozen like, what the heck is this? And I hear like a whistle chirp, very high pitched whistle chirp that came from under the stand of the hawthorn trees, which being 11 o'clock, it was like a very dark shadow there. And I was like, oh, just heard that chirp, and this beast it was like magnificent. I wasn't afraid. I was just more instantly shocked, because growing up, having the run of the fields, I was king of my domain. There was never anything I had to fear, because I never saw anything to fear. And when I saw this thing, I was shocked. I wasn't afraid. I was just amazed and in wonderment. What is this creature? But when I heard that whistle chirp, this beast just turned about a 90-degree turn, and it had a human type ear. I mean, it looked like its head was kind of on its shoulders. It was just so muscular. It just turned. It never looked at me. We never made eye contact. It just turned and took about 3 big steps, and then just ducked and went under that tree into like total shade and darkness. And I'm standing there and immediately that's kind of like when I think the fear aspect kicked in, and I'm like looking behind me. It's like, are there more of these creatures like that I have to worry about coming up and sneaking behind me? I mean, I'm not that far from my house, but I am like, whoa, this is like odd. And so then I'm standing there just frozen for, I don't know, maybe like a minute or 30 seconds to a minute. It's kind of hard to tell. But then I just backed out from behind that huge briar bush, and I'm thinking, what in the heck was that? I mean, I have never, ever in my life. And then my curiosity got piqued, and I'm like, what was that? I'm standing there just rationalizing with myself. I was like, did I just see what I saw? And I'm like, okay, well, if I back out, and then I thought, if I back out and go around this huge briar bush, I should have a better straight line of sight in to under that tree stand. So I backed out, and I look behind me, because by then my hair is on the back of my neck, and I'm like, I want to make sure there's nothing going to get me from behind. I come around, and when I just get around to the side of that bush, and I kind of crouch down to look to see if I could see anything. And of course, being with the sun so bright and beating down, and those trees they're very dense stand of trees, I couldn't really make out anything. But then the next thing that I knew was, it was like a semi-truck or a freight train just took off out the backside of that tree stand, and it was literally like just, and I'm out here standing behind a huge briar bush, and there's briars everywhere. And I'm like, holy crap. I mean, anything that can run through those briars, and they weren't wearing a pair of Carhartts and gloves, you're just going to get shredded. And as they took off, I knew the terrain of the land. And we're kind of down in the river basin. There was, of course, hills on either side up to the upper fields. And they took off running. And as they ran through the briars, they were like grabbing the tree trunks. I could see the treetops shaking as they ran up along that profile of where the river bottom from floods from over the ages has kind of determined. But I was like standing there with my stick, just like, holy crap, what did I just see? And I was like thinking, well, the only thing I have at the gun is a 22. And I'm like, a 22 is not going to, it'll be a beast thing to this creature. And I was just literally, I guess, blown away. And after all the, I guess, odds and ends of craziness that had happened, it wasn't until later when I could like look back and kind of formulate that these things have probably been around watching us and have been here, but they haven't really bothered us. Yeah, they might steal some food opportunities. A pet might go missing once in a while. But I literally did not go back into those woods or out into the fields for about 3 years until I came to that realization. These things have been here all along. It's like they haven't really ever bothered me. They may have watched and wondered, why is this weirdo walking back and forth in the fields several times a year when there's no food out there. Why is this guy doing this? They were more curious. I think they found me more than I found them. And it was just because of their curiosity. And I believe that they're very curious and they wonder what and why we do things, why we are just busy going on with our lives and we're not even aware that they're there. And it wasn't until like I literally walked up upon one and saw one that close that there was no denying. I could not tell myself, oh, this is something else, or this is a bear, this is a cow, this is that. It was like, no, I just physically, boom, here it is. And like the commercial where your head explodes and purple dust comes out. That was kind of like how I was at that moment. I was just like, I thought us humans but we had for many, many years because we eradicated all the wildlife. But once they started introducing the wildlife back, well, now there's more food sources. Now there's more reason for other creatures to feed on those food sources. So I guess that's my story. Again, I have just always kind of held this to myself. I told friends and family, I don't care if they think I'm crazy. They probably thought I was crazy before, but it's like, hey, I just want people to know that, yes, these creatures are there. They don't seem to harm us unless, again, any wild creature you put in a corner is going to fight back. We would do the same. So this is just what happened to me. And I hope anybody can at least take it for what it is. And nowadays, there are so many coyotes around here in rural Ohio, and it's dangerous to go out into the woods. So always have something to protect yourself, whether it's a machete, a stick, whatever, a friend with a gun if you don't carry guns. But yeah, wildlife is back. So just be careful. Don't attack them. They didn't attack me. They had every chance to. I was unarmed, but they were more like, yeah, some people say like, oh, they do mind speak. Well, I'm like, this guy, they didn't have to do mind speak. Their display alone showed me, hey, stay away. You don't want to mess with us. I don't need mind speak to figure that much out. But again, Vic, love your show. Thank you very much for letting me come on here and give you my experience.
My Bigfoot sighting occurred on a late afternoon in February 1969. Hello, my name is David. When I had my encounter, I was 14 years old. We lived out in the country outside the city limits, and often I would take my dog and we would walk to a nearby lake, which was about a half a mile away, and go hunting. Not anything particular, but just to get out of the house and go hunting and exploring. That particular February, the weather was clear, it was cold, and there was a pretty good wind coming directly out of the north. So we left to go down by the lake, and knowing that the wind was out of the north, I had a good idea that I had a better chance of sneaking up on anything that was either around the lake or on the lake. We would get duck and geese that would come in that time of year. I also want to go over the lay of the land where we lived at. Again, we lived outside the city limits on some acreage that overlooked a wide creek that had an even wider area of low-lying land that would flood when the creek went over its banks. So this lake was also in that low-lying area just off the creek, and again about a half mile from our house. The land behind our house was flat, open farmland that went on for miles. Like the farmland, our land was up on a higher elevation, so there was a slope or a knoll that went down to the creek and to the lake area. I should also say that the creek, the lake, and much of the low-lying area had trees and heavy brush. Once we left the house, my dog Heidi, we headed to the lake, and approaching the lake, we kept a lookout for anything. At 14, I didn't care what it was. I was most likely going to shoot it. Being out in the country, and I was quite adept at using a gun, we had killed quite a few rattlesnakes around our home during the warmer months, and most of our family pets had all been bitten by rattlesnakes, so it wasn't too much to shoot, anything that went around, whether it be a small game or birds. So when we got to the lake, I had a small blind set up, and there was a chair there that I would sit in and stay quiet while scanning the area. I don't know how long we were there. I happened to look up towards my left a little bit, and up on top of this knoll, I saw something large, very tall, with his arms raised up above its head. I quickly glanced down to where I had set my rifle, and when I looked back up to where this creature was standing, it was gone. So I took off running as fast as I can up to the top of the knoll and looked around. Again, I'm looking out over farmland. There's no crops. It's in the wintertime, so there's no crops. And this thing is just gone. It's vanished in thin air. I looked around, nothing. Didn't think too much of it. And so my dog Heidi and I went back to the house. After the encounter and through the years, I didn't give it much thought. Back in 1969, we didn't have internet, we didn't have cable TV, and the school I went to had 8 rooms and 8 grades. So there wasn't a whole lot of outside news or things that kids spoke about other than, the basketball game coming up or the volleyball game, things of that such in nature. So many years later, in fact, in the year 2000, one evening after work, I came home, was relaxing, and I was watching a show on Bigfoot. And it was during the show, they mentioned how a Bigfoot will raise their arms above their head to intimidate an intruder. And that's when it struck me, what I saw. It all just came to light. Looking back and knowing what I know now, I wish I would have looked for footprints or some other sort of tracks at that time, but I didn't. So I kept this sighting to myself for many, many years until I watched that show that night. And then after that, I was very particular of who I told the story to. Oftentimes raised eyebrows and a laugh. They probably thought I was crazy, but it was like somebody turned the light on and coming into a room when I saw that show that night. So anyway, that is my sighting. I haven't seen anything since. I go off in the woods often. In fact, I'm leaving for northern New Mexico and northern Arizona in just a few more days. And while traveling, just like many times in the past, I stay out in the woods and I listen. I have a keen sense, but I've yet to encounter another one. Anyway, that is my Bigfoot sighting story.
Well, that's it for tonight's show. If you've had a Bigfoot sighting and would like to be a guest, please go to mybigfootsighting.com and let us know. Thanks for listening. Have a great night.
Seen a bunch of rundown no-horse towns where the church is the backbone, loves and the plow, and the five-string melodies grooving, with the farmland rows where the roots run deep, beyond the noise of the busy streets, where the songs of the South are soothing. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Yeah.